Minoru Suzuki is and was a prodigy. Anyone will tell you that much. In high school, he won his regional amateur wrestling tournament for Kanagawa Prefecture, which as I understand would be the equivalent of winning state in the US, and then went on to place second at nationals, becoming an Olympic alternate. Inspired by the legendary Antonio Inoki, he would soon thereafter enter the New Japan Pro Wrestling Dojo, where he came under the mentorship of Karl Gotch. Gotch, while an exceptional shoot wrestler, was a hater of the highest order. And despite thinking that almost every wrestler since the invention of color TV was trash compared to himself or Lou Thesz, he actually praised Suzuki a lot in several interviews in the later part of his life. Clearly this mentorship meant a lot to Suzuki, as he named his finisher after Karl, adopted a lot of heel mannerisms from Gotch, and also from Yoshiaki Fujiwara, another product of Karl's tutelage. Suzuki would go on to form a deep connection with Fujiwara, who would serve as another important mentor after his time in New Japan. All of this is to say, Suzuki was the total package, immediately. While I obviously can't show you on YouTube, Suzuki had a match with Inoki himself in 1989 that proved this. Minoru had debuted only a year prior, and yet, standing face to face with his idol and a national hero, he smacked Inoki right across the face and stole the show. Obviously, this was intentional as a way for him to get over, but everything from the facial expressions to technical acumen to just the way he carried himself as if he didn't have a care in the world communicated that he was ready for the big time. He carried himself as a little scamp with all the self-assured arrogance of a prodigy who knows that he is one, and his slightly silly, roguish edge to his heel persona was reinforced by an incredibly funny anecdote wherein he apparently blew his first New Japan paycheck on sex workers. All that being said, unless he found some avenue to rise directly to the top, he was going to spend a lot of time paying his dues before he was a Fujinami or a Hase, let alone a musketeer. But Suzuki wasn't about all that. No, he was going to find a path to stardom, sooner rather than later. Masakatsu Funaki is a similar tale. A wunderkind if there ever was one, but much less straightforward. When Funaki was very young, his dad abandoned his family, but instead of killing his dreams, it seemed to have made him stronger, as instead of going to high school, he chose to drop out entirely, and at the age of 15, he entered the New Japan Dojo, inexplicably passing the entrance exam, graduating, and debuting as a junior heavyweight, all before he would have been able to get a driver's license in the US. Amidst work as a jobber in the junior heavyweight division and excursions into Europe, where he was billed as Flying Funaki, he formed a close brotherly bond with Suzuki and the aforementioned Fujiwara. Like Minoru, he was talented not just as a performer, but as a shoot wrestler. And while not as technically proficient as Suzuki according to Karl Gotch, which of course is no diss given how good Suzuki was, an Olympic alternate, he was also a freak athlete to boot. The two became fast friends once they met, and ostensibly became joined at the hip for the next decade or so of their careers. Unfortunately, in an era where it was ostensibly the heavyweight scene or nothing, Funaki would need a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to set himself apart. An environment that first and foremost promoted shoot wrestling. And as tensions rose in New Japan, they would find exactly that. To make a long story short, Akira Maeda things happened, and as he spearheaded the so-called newborn UWF promotion, a revival of the mid-80s Fed, they found their perfect territory. Maeda was in a very interesting situation, with a need to acquire shoot wrestling talent, but also having pissed off a bunch of world-class shooters like Satoru Sayama and the original UWF. The solution was to buy out the contracts of Fujiwara, Funaki, and Suzuki, and the trio would effectively run the organization. Funaki becoming the second biggest draw outside of Maeda himself, having a generational match against Tatsuo Nakano, which my buddy Andos made a video on, I'll link it below. However, as this promotion folded, as many UWF splinter promotions were wont to do at the time, and the trio would found Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, a promotion that definitely had no shady business practices, no matter how much Yuki Ishikawa implied as much in my interview with him. You should absolutely go and watch if you haven't already. Lasting for 6 years, it was actually fairly successful. But as it went on, Funaki, Suzuki, and others like Ken Shamrock and Takaku Fuke were dissatisfied with the decreased focus on the shoot wrestling that they loved and excelled at. While I'm not sure how acrimonious the split was, as all parties involved are seemingly on good terms once again nowadays, these disenfranchised shooters need a place of their own, and in order to go forward, they needed to go back. But before we get to the genesis of modern MMA, we have to start with Suzuki and Funaki's first meeting inside the squared circle, on April 14th, 1990, within the newborn UWF. It may not seem incredibly important, but soon you'll understand. As the two take to the ring and the referee sets things up, there's already a tone I can only describe as brotherly as the two shit-talk each other, with Funaki even lightly headbutting his friend before they're separated. The bell rings and the two circle. Suzuki seen in a rare non-black trunks fit in blue and white, and Funaki making up the difference with black trunks and some silly catch wrestler high socks. Minoru establishes wrist control before shooting in for a single leg. For those unfamiliar with amateur wrestling takedowns, in order to finish this, Suzuki either needs to run the pipe with his head to the outside of the hips, or chase the far side ankle to trip it. It appears he wants the latter, and the two spin as Funaki attempts to muscle his way out, but he adjusts and flips over Suzuki with head and arm control. He attempts to take it mount, but Suzuki is already beginning to buck, turning to turtle and pulling his hips away from Funaki trying to cradle him. In a move very predictive of the entire rest of each men's careers, he attempts to roll for a leg before Funaki firmly establishes the back ride he was looking for. It might seem like just completely flow rolling without any intent to entertain, but there's a story being told here, with Suzuki working from underneath, and each time he presents a new technique to try and outwit Funaki, the beast with the yee-yee-ass haircut swats him down. Funaki tries to punch in a choke and then neck lock, but Minoru once again creatively attacks the legs, snatching the nearby ankle in order to create distance to wrestle up. Funaki regains control before Suzuki presents the first serious submission attempt, attacking a toe hold until the two roll into the ropes. The story from here on is evident. Suzuki wants to aggressively pursue a submission at all costs, from any position, whereas the good boy Funaki would rather just wrestle for control for an eventual finishing hold. It's very technico versus rudo type psychology applied to a shoot wrestling context. After a tie-up, Suzuki tosses Funaki into a scarf hold before theatrically hopping over to the other side. Funaki of course exploits this and hops back into a wrestling ride. Suzuki works for a Kimura but ends up giving bottom north-south, a favorite position of this era of catch wrestlers to attack wrist or arm locks. Sensing danger, Suzuki frames and rolls, reversing the position. It's here we start to see the familiar maniacal flair of Suzuki, who wrenches any extremity he can get a hold of before going for a spinning armbar from the turtle that he would later employ in shoots. From here we go to a leg entanglement that's incredibly pro wrestling, Suzuki ardently pursuing a heel hook whilst keeping his own ankle protected, and our hero Funaki slowly and methodically reverses until Suzuki is forced to grab the ropes. If this were rings and there were points, the two would now be tied. Now things are truly serious, and the two pummel for the ties on the feet, Suzuki finally shooting before getting the trip finish to the single leg he couldn't get in the first exchange. It's like poetry, it rhymes. Unfortunately for him, he's reversed by the freak athlete that is Funaki, who basically gets a full guard sweep, but the sneaky Minoru grabs an anticipatory rope break right in the back of the frame you might miss upon first viewing. It's next Funaki who blinks as Suzuki stuffs his takedown, turning him over to his side before jumping onto a knee bar. Eventually a rope break is forced, and two once again enter a heavy clinch, with Funaki hitting a whizzer kick that forces his opponent down to the mat. Rather than surrendering position, Suzuki grabs what's called an ankle bite in amateur wrestling. In an act of willpower, Suzuki forces his way up to the top and grabs a disgusting chin lock that comes just shy of finishing the fight. Unfortunately for him, his eagerness to stop things here and now means that he falls off the back of Funaki and he moves to an armbar that is far too loose. Funaki grabs his leg for survival in a very silly exchange, but that doesn't prevent Suzuki from locking in an armbar, and Funaki basically has to shove him into the ropes. Both men know the next point wins at this point, and as they approach the tie-up with a life-or-death seriousness, Funaki drops himself into guard, perhaps trying to get a quick reversal like he obtained previously, and instead Suzuki plays his last card, rolling for an armbar that's reversed before it's even secured as Funaki postures up into a leg entanglement. Each man goes for a heel hook in what's ostensibly a Wild West duel, and Funaki's the quicker draw. Suzuki taps incredibly frantically, and regardless of whether that's genuine panic from a heel hook or him doing a silly character moment, it really adds to the finish. 4 stars from me. The aftermath of a seemingly insignificant match is incredibly interesting. As if you hadn't noticed, no strikes were thrown in this entire match. Evidently this was not okayed with Maeda previously, but I'm sure going into business for themselves made him proud as he was angry. This is a very different style of match from the OG UWF and UWFI, as the two focus on a kind of storytelling more at home with the later Rings promotion than the comparatively flashy 80s shoot style full of kicks and other bombastic strikes and Vaders. In an interesting development, Carl the Grouch actually loved this match, naming it one of the best matches he had ever seen, perhaps because it harkened back to that carnival prize fight era pro wrestling he was raised on. The two clearly had something cooking, and with the help of their aforementioned friends, it was going to be ready to serve. All of this takes us to Pancrase, the first promotion in Japan that at least billed itself as a complete shoot, even if that was often far from the case. While I'm not going to rehash the entire history of the promotion, more talented men than me have done so before, I'll provide those unfamiliar with a few basics. The promotion was named after the ancient Greek sport of pancration, an early Olympic mainstay that basically resembled a classical era version of no-holds-barred combat, except of course this being ancient Greece, everyone was nude, oiled, and trying not to get too hurt in order to still make the post-game orgy. I'm not going to rule that out from being part of the initial pitch for funding, but I suspect whoever gave them the seed money had some reservations on going that far. The gist of the promotion is basically MMA under pro wrestling rules. It's early MMA no holds barred, except much like pro wrestling, no closed fist strikes to the head, limited ground and pound, and boxing style knockdowns. And there are rope breaks, albeit a limited number of them. In the case that the bout went to a decision, whoever burned less rope breaks or got knocked down less won, just like Fighting Network rings. The worked nature of it is very charming to me, as according to Bas Rutten, they asked you if you were comfortable working fights or not when you came in, and they were very respectful if you declined. It basically became completely a shoot by the end, due to the influence of men like Rutten, Frank Shamrock, and others, but the way it was worked was often way weirder than just fixing the fight via picking a winner like we think of with Takada versus Mark Coleman. Instead, there would often be worked segments rather than just taking a dive, though that did happen too. The Japanese audience had never seen what proper no-holds-barred looked like, nor had anyone outside of UFC 1 that took place the same year that Pancrase started, or Vale Tudo fights in Brazil, and thus the public expected a certain product from a pro wrestling show, or at least pro wrestling adjacent show. Because of this, a common match structure might be working the opening 5 to 10 minutes of chain wrestling before fully going for the win. A full shoot can be unsatisfying if it ends early and suddenly, so they wanted crowds to at least get a good amount of match before throwing live rounds. However, there were absolutely full-on dives that happened within the promotion, and this takes us to the only Pancrase bout between Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki on October 15th, 1994, which for all intents and purposes is a wrestling match. In the first year of the promotion, it was very important to keep the most marketable stars strong, and perhaps that's why Suzuki took a dive like this to keep Funaki strong. Based on how they performed in training, Suzuki was considered the best project of the native talent. But at this point, Funaki was a larger star, and also a better pro wrestler from New Japan to Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, so perhaps measures had to be taken to keep the money flowing. There's a deeply convoluted alternate explanation for why this match unfolded like it did, involving drama between Suzuki and Ken Shamrock, BJJ, and knee bars, but ultimately using Occam's razor here, I think that's a cope and this is simply a work. You'll see what I mean as the fight starts. The walkouts are significant here as Suzuki has already mastered the pro wrestling entrance, presenting him as the 80s villain heel he needed to be, with his trademark towel, scowl, and general disdain for everyone around him. Funaki emerges in much sillier fashion, with a leather trench coat and headband, looking exactly like the martial arts movie hero he modeled himself after as the son of an owner of a theater that showed B-movies. Once they're in the ring, the two size each other up, and Suzuki's little smirk is infectious. He's such a great character worker. The fight, in air quotes, begins with the bang as Funaki goes for a theatrical leg sweep, throwing up kicks until Suzuki backs off and lets him up. Suzuki then goes for a similarly ridiculous leaping kick that Funaki dives under. Wow, it's almost like he knew it was going to happen, before Funaki gets him to the ropes for an explosive double leg. Funaki seems intent on playing guard, reversing using a butterfly sweep to get Suzuki off of him after Minoru reverses, but eats some heavy palm strikes. Part of the legend around this is that Funaki wanted to show off his BJJ he learned in America, and that's probably partly true in general for this year, but he had employed the guard in previous wrestling matches anyways, including the butterfly sweep. Funaki uses up kicks again to get back to his feet, and Suzuki hits some crazy facial expressions to work the crowd. A double chained into a trip earns Funaki the back, but he's reversed in turn with a savvy Kimura that allows Suzuki to flow through a series of attacks. Once they get back up, Suzuki is returned to the mat with a brutal trip, Funaki gets the back, and here we see the really funny worked stoppage. Suzuki is intelligently defending his neck from behind, and then randomly decides to stop defending it against Funaki, who grabs a chin lock. Suzuki doesn't seem to appear to tap from the camera angle of the TV broadcast, and then the referee, who's presumably in on the work, just abruptly stops it, so either he thought the chin lock was going to kill him, or that he passed out from the chin lock. This whole affair is really weird, but honestly it's so silly that I really enjoy it. If this were a wrestling match, and it basically is, then I'd call it 3 stars, mostly off of the charisma of both involved. From that point, Pancrase hit some major highs. Both men would hoist the King of Pancrase title at least once, have a ton of fights, and presumably make a ton of money. However, as it went from the mid-90s to the late 90s and 2000s, it became apparent that their brand of shoot fighting, while fun and inventive, was not going to win them fights against the next generation of prize fighters, men who would go on to populate the rosters of the UFC and Pride, such as the aforementioned Frank Shamrock and Bas Rutten. And so, the brothers in arms parted ways, with Suzuki returning to wrestling full-time in 2003, whereas Funaki would take another 6 years to do the same, returning in 2009. However, they would not be in a shoot wrestling context. It would be, honest to God, wrestling. When Funaki returned to pro wrestling, it was in a very different environment than he left it, albeit with some familiar faces. Instead of returning to New Japan, he debuted in All Japan Pro Wrestling, which had changed a lot since the Royal Road had been paved. In a period not often discussed beyond extremely hardcore circles, after the untimely death of Giant Baba and the Noah Exodus, one man stepped forward to save the promotion. That being Keiji Muto, the former New Japan star and musketeer who started the pro wrestling love era. Through a series of before unfathomable co-promotions with other wrestling feds like New Japan and even the kickboxing and MMA promotion Cape One, Muto kept the lights on with what he had, riding some of that Pride era MMA crossover momentum in the same way New Japan did during the same time period. It might then make sense that this is where Funaki would re-emerge, coaxed back to wrestling by Muto, with his first match being tagging with Muto against Masahiro Chono and none other than Minoru Suzuki. But this was not the same men that he knew. When Suzuki returned to pro wrestling, it wasn't as a returning beloved hero, but doing what he does best, being a bastard man. He attacked Muto in his debut and glued himself to the title scene, challenging for the Triple Crown several times and eventually winning it from Satoshi Kojima. While he wouldn't hold on to gold for super long, he had re-established himself as a top draw in wrestling, and while not yet the Suzuki-gun kingpin we would know, he did his best to raise hell with his brothers in arms from Gurentai. This is a man who had tortured Kobashi during the Reign of Fire, and while by no means a murdered grandpa at only 41 years old, The character we've come to know and love was codified. Suzuki was an aloof prick before he left wrestling, but now that he was back, he'd become downright sadistic, a spider who wanted to pick you apart in his web. The two would have their first singles match in years very shortly after Funaki's tag team return, but it's a very short match with a DQ finish first and foremost, designed to build heat between the two rather than be anything incredibly substantive, so I'm not going to analyze it here. They would continue to face each other in tag team action in the coming month, and it felt like we were building to something major. Thankfully, Muta was indeed doing just that, and the blow-off between the two would take place in the crucible of combat inside a steel cage. In perfect cowboy movie fashion, we have our hero in white and villain in black, Funaki rocking some fight trunks and Suzuki in his usual gear, sporting the horrifying haircut he loved at the time. The two circle the cage a few times to start, and there's a feeling of weight and anxiety that's palpable. After not sharing the ring together in so long in singles affair, something feels off for the two warriors, perhaps feeling some major deja vu from the predicament. These are two sharks, but blood is not yet in the water, so they're just waiting to pounce. The two finally lock up with their hands, Suzuki's hand shaking, but at least this bit is a feint as he throws a kick off the tie-up. Funaki tries one of his own off the subsequent lockup, but the kick is caught by Suzuki, who runs the pipe. Funaki is still in a good position as he lands on the mat, however, landing in the perfect setup for a triangle choke before breaking Suzuki's posture with a shoulder crunch and using the momentum to sweep him. Unlike Pancrase, ground and pound is fully legal here, and some half-hearted body shots from Funaki take enough focus away to allow Suzuki to sweep him back. Even though we're on the mat, there's still that feeling of anxiety, as if any second something is going to explode, and while not quite that, Funaki throws up an armbar and then triangle from his guard, seriously threatening Minoru, who has to turn away from the hold to break it, immediately grabbing a Kimura from side control. This is an attack he loves in shoot fights, turning to what's basically north-south position with the double wrist lock in order to simultaneously attack the crooked head scissors. He declines to do so here, and instead does a cute little juke as he starts to stand up, trying to fake out Funaki as to which direction he'll attack, and then rolling back for the armbar. He tries to break the grip of his foe, but Funaki back rolls and stands up. Suzuki likes what he sees and shoots for a single, but gets rejected in hilarious fashion, eating a hard knee to the head. This is the explosion we were waiting for, and Funaki spares no fury, throwing rapid headbutts on the ground and rolling for the armbar after Suzuki frames on him to try and prevent the onslaught. Suzuki tries to do more or less what he had done before to turn out of the hold, but can't afford to defend the same way twice, against someone who knows him so well, and Funaki rolls for a toe hold from the rear, Suzuki ripped down in a moment of agony. His forehead is bleeding from the headbutts. Suzuki screams in pain and fury, trying to pull his knee out of the entanglement as Funaki cranks the living fuck out of his foot. Not able to finish him from pure pain compliance, Funaki switches to a heel hook, the same hold that is scored for him in the early newborn UWF. It's only when Suzuki is able to clear the knee line, aided by a little kick, that returns him to the feet. The relative civility that had previously defined the exchanges on the feet is gone, as Funaki rips kicks to the body, even bouncing himself off the ropes to deliver a brutal knee to the shoulder. Suzuki's knees begin to buckle, and after seeing plenty of blood to swarm after, Funaki tries for the same strike, and is punished for doing so, getting picked up and flung into the cage, the bounce he does off the mat being insult to injury. The referee checks if both men are able to continue as Suzuki stumbles around the mat, and Funaki's head begins gushing blood from the slam against the chain link, and both are deemed fine to continue. Given the green light to continue his onslaught, Minoru begins teeing off on his fallen foe, tearing at his hair and flinging him into the fence. This isn't merely a heat segment, but a fucking war crime, as he crowds him against the ropes, mashing his face repeatedly and even sending a kick to the back. Showing his true face as a sadist of the highest order, Suzuki basically does a little Joker dance in the center, stumbling maniacally as Funaki begins to recover. Trying to finish off a diminished opponent who has barely made it back to his feet, Funaki applies the double wrist lock, flipping his foe to the ground before deciding to return the favor from earlier and rain headbutts. He switches to the armbar, but Funaki just barely completes the same back roll as before, but much more pained, crawling forward in agony instead of springing to his feet. Suzuki exploits this brilliantly, holding onto the arm in what's more or less a hammerlock before rolling him back to the same position. He can't quite get the breaking angle he wants due to the stubbornness of Funaki, and triangles his legs before standing back up. Funaki seems out on the feet until he employs a brutal rolling thunder kick, which swings the momentum firmly back in his direction as he unleashes a barrage of strikes to the body once again. He tries to capitalize with a piledriver thingy that ends up looking like a Styles Clash, but then goes for an awesome inverted triangle choke. One of the keys to a great submission sequence in pro wrestling is the facial expression of the man in the holds, and doing this allows Suzuki to convulse his face in terror, looking like Gollum ensnared by the elven rope, until he manages to roll Funaki off of him. He's on top, but not yet able to break the hold, and so he employs the time-honored high-level technique of jamming your finger into someone's eye, favored by such martial arts luminaries such as Gerard Gordeau or John Rubber Ducky Jones, which does in fact wrench himself free in absolutely disgusting fashion. Whatever kinship these men once had is now out the window and into the river, and whatever human courtesy they would have shown their fellow human combatant is gone too. These are just two animals tearing chunks out of each other in what vaguely resembles a sporting contest. Strikes are traded, and Suzuki resumes his previous torture with some new additions, elbow dropping a fallen Funaki before wrenching a Fujiwara armbar from a squat. When he realizes he can't score, he pulls the hair, then simply stomps out his foe. Unfortunately for the king to the world, a standing sleeper turns into a beautiful backdrop suplex for Funaki, hitting 2 in a row after Suzuki blitzes him while stunned. Masakatsu gets the back and seems to have things wrapped up, but much like Michael Chandler did in his fights versus Charles Oliveira, Suzuki summons as much determination as he can to rise up and hit a senton, breaking him free. The momentum is roughly equal now, but neither man can go on for much longer. The strikes become slappy rather than solid, and both stumble in a dance of smacks and boots. Funaki gets a knockdown off a beautiful slip, but subsequently gives up the back standing, ending up in the same standing sleeper he had applied earlier. Just like Suzuki, he survives with determination, leading Minoru switch to the Gotch style. Suzuki nearly knocks him out, capitalizing on the damage with another deep sleeper attempt, but Funaki tosses him overhead, landing a beautiful kick that rocks the monster in front of him. From here, it's a cowboy duel once again, and the next shot will be the one that kills. After another exhausted exchange, Funaki lands another one of those knees from earlier, but rather than to the body, straight to the fucking head. Almost out of habit rather than anything else, Suzuki rises to his knees in defiance before finally keeling over, earning Funaki the win by knockout. With the exception of a few differences in signature moves and a major difference in temperament, this was a mirror match. Each man has an identical wrestling background, down from who trained them to which promotions they worked for. When people this intimately familiar with each other go to war, it's less about surprising your opponent and more about keeping pace. Much like a fast-paced basketball game, neither man can really keep the other from scoring, they can only try to slow them down to the best of their ability. Where Suzuki messed up was trying to break the spirit of Funaki rather than out-wrestle him. Against anybody else that might have been possible, but against a man that might as well be your brother, that was never going to happen. You don't quit against your brother. Not because you hate him, but because long after the fight, you'll never hear the end of it. Funaki has earned his bragging rights and proved himself the King of Kings. 4.5 stars. The two Pancrase founders would go on to have a few more matches subsequently in All Japan, some tag matches and tournament bouts, but this was the real end of a sustained singles rivalry between the two. Funaki had beaten him in a pure grappling match in UWF, in a bout under Pancrase's eclectic rules, and now years later as two older men brawling Fry Takayama style inside of a steel cage. Quite simply, there was nothing left to prove, unless they want to run it back at 60 in a boxing match or something, but I'm okay not saying that. Their twin careers have been fascinating and glorious, with many what-ifs such as what would happen if they stayed in New Japan, never created Pancrase, or attempted to fight in the early UFC or Pride tournaments. Unlike other careers filled with what-ifs, however, their legacies are already amazing. All of those hypotheticals would just be icing on the cake. Suzuki is of course much more well known these days because of how he rampaged across Pro Res in the late 2000s to 2010s, but Funaki hasn't gone anywhere either, with his match against Josh Barnett a few years ago featuring in my 5-match primer on Josh you can find on this channel. Given that Yoshiaki Fujiwara is in his 70s and still wrestling good, both of our Kings of Pancrase are probably here to stay for a while longer. Both are living legends across multiple sports, and I'm endlessly grateful for what each man has built and accomplished. Each man had their time as ruler of their domain, and their domain, of course, is the King of Sports.